All right, so we're diving into Thaksinomics today. You've brought like a whole stack of research papers and analysis and everything.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating topic.
I'm ready to get into it.
Yeah.
So what exactly is Thaksinomics? Like when I see that word, what am I even talking about?
Yeah, so basically it's this unique set of economic policies closely tied to Thaksin Shinawatra's time as prime minister in Thailand back in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And, the term itself, it really became like this buzzword, synonymous with his whole brand of politics, right? His attempt to kind of create this new and distinct economic model for the country.
So he wasn't just like following what had been done before.
No, not at all. Thaksinomics was all about setting itself apart from traditional Thai politics, A&D, from like the IMF stuff after the 97 crisis.
Right.
It was forging a new path.
Right.
Which is interesting because it's kind of got this dual nature to it.
Dual nature. Okay, now you've got to tell me more. What's like the two sides of this?
Think about it this way. You've got these very populist domestic policies, but they're happening at the same time as these like aggressive neoliberal capitalist strategies.
That's a fascinating combination. Populism and free market capitalism. How does that even work?
Yeah, so let's break that down a little. I think the easiest place to start is with what probably resonated with most Thai people at the time, those populist policies.
Okay.
This was about appealing directly to the rural and the middle class.
Which is where those policies that I've seen, like the 30-bait healthcare, would come in.
Yeah.
That's a pretty memorable campaign promise, I got to say.
Absolutely. That's a perfect example. You get universal healthcare for basically nothing, right? And then you've got programs like the Village Development Funds, which pumped money directly into these rural communities.
So it's like immediate tangible benefit. No wonder it was popular.
Exactly. But the question is, and this is something a lot of these sources get into, was it too good to be true?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. It's like you can't argue with healthcare that cheap, but if it's not sustainable, I don't know. Did the research mention downsides to that approach?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There were definitely criticisms, mainly that it created this dependence on the state, Like, was it truly empowering people or was it making them reliant on government handouts? And what does that do to long-term thinking and economic growth?
So it's the classic short-term gain versus long-term vision problem. Okay, so that's the one side. That's the populism. What about the other side, the neoliberal angle? How did that play out?
So that's where things get really interesting. You see this big push for privatization of state enterprises, attracting tons of foreign investment, basically trying to insert Thailand as like a major player in the global market. And you got to remember, this is the early 2000s.
Right.
Neoliberalism is the dominant economic ideology. Thaksin wanted to be on that wave, even
though initially he kind of positioned himself against the IMF and those ideas.
Exactly. It's this weird tension. But in practice, it meant embracing some of those core principles.
So what did that actually look like? Like, give me a concrete example of a policy that reflects this.
Yeah, so one of the big ones that comes up is the creation of things like the Thai Asset Management Corporation, TAMC.
Catchy.
Right. But this was part of a bigger strategy to use what are called quasi-fiscal policies, basically finding creative ways to spend government money without it technically being government spending, bypassing the normal channels.
So less red tape, more direct action.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I can see how that would be appealing, but also maybe a little risky.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a big part of what the research grapples with. On the one hand, these policies got results. Like, you can't argue that they didn't attract foreign capital and boost the economy in the short term. But there are definitely questions about transparency, right? Like, things moved so fast with so much privatization, especially given Thaksin's own business background.
Yeah, okay, I see where you're going with this.
There were definitely some eyebrows raised about whether it was all above board, whether there were conflicts of interest, a lack of accountability, that kind of thing.
We've got the populism. We've got these kind of like, I don't know, shady-sounding dealings going on. This is juicy stuff.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, how did this actually play out for Thailand? Like, what were the results of this grand experiment?
So last time we were talking about Thaksinomics, right? This whole mix of populism and neoliberalism, and I'm dying to know how that actually worked out in practice.
Yeah, well, it definitely wasn't boring, let's put it that way.
I bet.
Thaksin was not afraid to shake things up, and the research really emphasizes how quickly and drastically he implemented his reforms.
We talked about the Thai Asset Management Corporation, that TMC thing, but were there other examples of what you called quasi-fiscal policy?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like, one that comes to mind is the SMEs Bank.
SMEs?
Yeah, it stands for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. Basically, it was meant to give these businesses a way to get funding.
Okay.
Because they could bypass the traditional banks and lending systems.
So going around the normal channels again? Exactly. Direct funding, straight to these local businesses, cutting through the red tape.
Which sounds great in theory, but I'm guessing there's a but coming.
Well, yeah. The research we've got here points out that there were definitely criticisms about how the bank actually operated.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for one thing, the argument is that there wasn't enough oversight.
No.
And that sometimes loans were giving out based more on political connections than, the actual viability of a business plan.
So, good idea on paper, maybe not so much in practice.
Yeah, I mean, it really shows the challenge of trying to do things so quickly. Like, how do you balance speed and efficiency with making sure things are transparent and accountable? That's the million-dollar question.
That it is. And what about privatization? We kind of touched on that last time, that it was happening quickly.
Yeah.
What were the actual outcomes? Did it deliver on the promises of Thaksinomics?
It's a mixed bag. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, it definitely brought in foreign investment. And that did lead to some economic growth, at least in the short term. But there are some really interesting arguments in these sources that it actually ended up being counterproductive in some ways.
Oh, how so?
Well, the argument is that by privatizing so much so quickly, it kind of prevented Thailand from developing its own strong domestic industries. Like, local businesses just couldn't compete with these big foreign companies coming in.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like short-term gain, but maybe some long-term pain.
Exactly. And then you've got the whole question of who was really benefiting from all this growth. Like, yeah, the economy was growing, but was it actually improving the lives of everyday Thai people?
That's the question, right? Like, what was the impact on the ground?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, there were some definite successes, like GDP growth was significant under Thaksin, and poverty rates did go down.
Okay, so those are positives.
Absolutely. But, and there's always a but, right?
There always is.
The research also shows that income inequality actually got worse during this time. So even though some people were doing better, the gap between the rich and the poor was widening.
Ah, so that whole rising tide lifts all boats thing?
Yeah.
Maybe not so much.
Yeah, it's a classic example of that. And I think that's part of what made Thaksinomics so unstable in the long run.
Got a point. It wasn't all sunshine and roses then. I do remember reading that a lot of other countries were really interested in this model.
Oh, absolutely. There was a while where Thaksinomics was the model for developing countries.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, especially in Southeast Asia. It was like this perfect storm of, the economic success, the populism, this kind of new way of doing things. Leaders in places like Indonesia and Brunei, they were definitely paying attention.
So what happened? It was working, other countries were interested, but it obviously didn't last. Why not?
Well, for one thing, those cracks we were talking about, the transparency issues, the inequality, those were starting to show more and more.
Right.
But then, of course, you also have the whole political dimension, which in Thailand is never simple.
Okay, so before we get into all that, we've talked about the good and the bad, the successes, the controversies, but ultimately, was Thaksinomics a success or a failure?
See, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And like most things in economics and politics, it's not an easy answer.
I figured as much.
But that, my friend, is a conversation for part 3.
So we've spent all this time on Thaksinomics, the good, the bad, the ugly. But at the end of the day, was it good for Thailand? Was it a success?
Yeah, see, that's the thing. It's really not that simple.
I figured as much.
Looking at all this research, it's clear there's no easy answer. It wasn't a complete success, but it wasn't a total failure either. There's so much nuance.
So how do we make sense of it then? If we can't just slap a label on it.
Yeah.
What are the big takeaways? What's important to remember about Thaksinomics?
I think the biggest thing is how much it changed Thailand. Like, really fundamentally reshaped the country's political and economic landscape.
In ways that are still felt today.
Oh, absolutely. Some of it was intentional, some of it not, but those changes have had a lasting impact.
Like what? Give me a concrete example.
Well, take those populist policies we talked about,
Yeah.
right? Like that 30-bet healthcare. It was huge EE. People loved it, and it really did help a lot of people. But it also started this whole debate about the role of the state,
Right.
Did it empower people or make them dependent on the government? And how do you balance meeting immediate needs with creating long-term change? Those are questions we're still grappling with today, not just in Thailand, but everywhere.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man to fish.
Exactly. And that tension is at the heart of Thaksinomics. But it wasn't just the populist stuff, right? What about those neoliberal reforms? How have those held up over time?
Good point. Those were a big part of the story, too.
Right. And again, it's mixed. On the one hand, they definitely brought in investment. They boosted the economy. But a lot of the research we looked at also points to the downsides.
Like,
well, inequality, for one. The gap between the rich and the poor got bigger, even as the economy grew. So it makes you question, what kind of growth are we really talking about here? Who is it actually benefiting?
it's that same issue again. Growth for who? Whose economy are we talking about? It's something you see everywhere.
Yeah, and that's why I think looking at Thaksinomics is so interesting, because it's not just about Thailand, it's about these bigger questions that every country is facing.
Like what?
Like, how do you create an economy that works for everyone? How do you balance growth with sustainability? How much should the government be involved in the market? There are no easy answers, but Thaksinomics gives us this really fascinating case study. It shows us both what's possible and the potential pitfalls.
It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. Every country, every situation is unique. What worked in Thailand in the early 2000s, it might not work somewhere else, or even in Thailand today. You have to take everything into account.
The context.
Right. The political situation, the social factors, global trends. It's complicated. But that's what makes it so important to study, to learn from, because at the end of the day, these aren't just abstract economic theories. They affect real people's lives.
Well said. And that's what this whole deep dive has been about, hasn't it? Looking at the human impact of these big ideas. This has been fascinating, eye-opening even. It makes you think differently about the world.
That's what I love about these deep dives. Always something new to learn.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the fascinating and complex world of Thaksinomics. It's a story of big ideas, bold moves, and a legacy that continues to shape Thailand today. What will it take to build a more equitable and sustainable future? It's something we should all be thinking about. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious.